Have you ever felt watched in an empty prairie town or heard something moving beneath the frozen ground? Welcome back to Unspoken Fears. Tonight, we're venturing into the isolated small towns of Alberta, Canada, where 10 people encountered things that defy explanation. These accounts are real. Names and identifying details have been altered to protect privacy, but the events happened. We're sharing stories from the 1990s through 2024, each more disturbing than the last. Drop your location and current time in the comments below, hit subscribe, and let's begin. My name is Cade, and I'm a mining heritage surveyor for Parks Canada. I've spent the last 8 years documenting abandoned industrial sites across Alberta, making sure these pieces of history are preserved safely or at least properly sealed. In August 2019, I got assigned to the Atlas coal mine near Drumheller, one of the last wooden tipples still standing in Canada. It was supposed to be a routine structural assessment of the sealed sections deep in the mine's eastern drift. The kind of job I'd done dozens of times before. I've been underground in mines from the Crowsnest Pass to the Badlands, and nothing ever prepared me for what I found beneath Drumheller that summer. I arrived on site on August 14, 2019, around 9 in the morning. The Atlas coal mine operated from 1936 until 1979, and the main tourist sections are stable and well-maintained. My job was to survey the sealed-off areas that the public never sees, the deeper tunnels where coal was extracted in the final years of operation. I had my standard equipment: ground-penetrating radar, structural sensors, a high-powered headlamp, compass, GPS unit, and recording equipment to document everything for the Parks Canada database. The site manager, Body, met me at the entrance and gave me the access codes for the sealed gates. He mentioned that the deepest sections hadn't been entered since 1981, when they did the final safety inspections before permanent closure. He seemed nervous when he handed me the keys, kept glancing back at the entrance to the sealed section like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I asked if there were any safety concerns I should know about. He just shook his head and said to radio up if I needed anything, then walked back to the visitor center faster than necessary. The first hour underground was completely standard. The main tunnel was exactly as the 1979 maps indicated, with support beams showing expected deterioration for their age. I took my measurements, photographed the structural points, and worked my way deeper into the mountain. The air was cool and dry, typical for these Badlands coal mines. Around 11:30, I set up the ground-penetrating radar to scan the areas beyond the sealed walls, just to make sure there weren't any unexpected voids that could cause future collapses. That's when things stopped making sense. The radar showed an anomalous void approximately 60 meters past the sealed eastern wall. The problem was, according to every mine map from 1936 to 1979, there was nothing there. The eastern drift ended at the current sealed wall. I cross-referenced 3 different map sets, including the original survey maps from the Atlas Coal Company. None of them showed any tunnel or chamber in that location. I radioed Bodie and asked if there were any undocumented sections. He said absolutely not, that the mine had been thoroughly mapped for safety reasons. But the radar doesn't lie. There was a void there, and it was big, roughly 30 meters across based on the return signals. I found the unsealed access point around 1 in the afternoon. It was hidden behind a partial collapse that looked natural, but when I cleared some of the loose rock, I could see it had been deliberately staged. Someone had wanted this tunnel to look blocked when it wasn't. The passage beyond was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through with my pack. My headlamp cut through absolute darkness, and I immediately noticed something wrong with the rock walls. The stone had these crystalline patterns embedded in it, geometric formations that didn't match any natural mineral deposit I'd ever seen. They almost looked like circuitry, these intricate channels running through the rock in patterns that hurt to look at too directly. When I turned my head away and looked back, The patterns seemed different, rearranged somehow, though that should have been impossible. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. But I'm a surveyor, and my job is to document and report. I told myself the patterns were just unusual mineral deposits, maybe something related to the unique geology of the Drumheller area. I pushed deeper into the tunnel, taking photographs and measurements as I went. The passage sloped downward at about 15 degrees, taking me well below the main mine level. About 40 meters in, my compass started spinning. Not just drifting or showing magnetic interference, but spinning continuously like it couldn't find north at all. I pulled out my GPS unit to mark my position, but it just showed an error message. No signal, which made sense this deep underground, but it also couldn't establish a baseline position. The internal accelerometers that should have tracked my movement were showing impossible data, suggesting I'd somehow moved 300 meters laterally when I'd only walked 40 meters down a straight tunnel. I pulled out my backup analog compass. It was spinning too. Both of them, spinning in opposite directions, the needles moving in ways that violated basic physics. The tunnel opened into a chamber about 70 meters from where I'd entered. The geometry of this space was wrong in ways I still can't properly articulate. The corners didn't meet the way corners should. I'd stand in what looked like one position, turn 90 degrees, and somehow be facing a wall that shouldn't have been there based on the room's layout. The floor seemed level when I walked across it, but my spirit level showed it tilting at impossible angles that changed depending on where I stood. The walls curved in directions that three-dimensional space shouldn't allow. Looking at the chamber made my eyes water and gave me an instant headache. Like my brain was trying to process information it wasn't built to understand. But the worst part was what occupied the center of the chamber. I say occupied because there was clearly empty space there, a perfect sphere of nothing about 5 meters in diameter. But around this emptiness, the rock had been excavated in a pattern that was absolutely not made by human tools or any mining equipment I'd ever seen. The stone looked melted and reformed, flowing around this central void like it had been shaped by something that understood the rock on a molecular level. The surface had this residue on it, a thin film that caught my headlamp beam and split it into colors that don't exist in any spectrum I know. Looking at those colors made my thoughts feel sticky, like my consciousness was adhering to something it shouldn't touch. I reached out to touch the residue, and the moment my gloved finger made contact, the air pressure changed. It felt like the entire mountain was pressing down on me and simultaneously trying to pull me apart. My ears popped painfully, and I tasted copper and something else, something chemical and wrong that made my tongue go numb. The colors in the residue began to move, swirling in patterns that suggested intention, like whatever this substance was. It was aware I was there. I yanked my hand back and stumbled backward, and that's when I noticed the sounds. The chamber was filled with frequencies I shouldn't have been able to hear. They were below the normal range of human hearing, but I could feel them vibrating in my chest cavity, rattling my teeth, making my vision blur. The sounds had structure to them, patterns that almost resembled language or music, but from some acoustic system that had nothing to do with human communication. My recording equipment was running the whole time, capturing everything, though I didn't know that yet. All I knew in that moment was that I needed to get out of that chamber, out of that tunnel, back to the surface where geometry worked the way it should and air pressure stayed constant. I don't remember leaving. I have no memory of the walk back through the tunnel or squeezing through the concealed entrance. My next clear memory is standing outside the sealed gate in the main mine tunnel, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold my equipment. I checked my watch. It was 5:47 in the afternoon. I'd entered the hidden tunnel at 1:15. 4.5 hours had passed, but I could only account for maybe 90 minutes of that time. 4 hours were just gone, erased from my memory like they'd never happened. When I reviewed my recording equipment back at my hotel that night, I found something that still gives me nightmares. The audio had captured the entire event, including the hours I couldn't remember. For those missing 4 hours, the recording showed me standing motionless in that chamber, not moving, barely breathing, while those subsonic frequencies continued around me. But worse than that, when I isolated the low-frequency sounds and ran them through analysis software, they triggered something in my brain. Just listening to the playback caused immediate, overwhelming dread. My heart rate spiked, my hands started shaking, and I had this absolute certainty that something vast and terrible had noticed me in that chamber, and part of it had followed me out. I deleted the audio files immediately, but I can still hear those frequencies sometimes when it's very quiet, like they're playing on a loop in some part of my mind that can't shut them off. I filed my official report with Parks Canada on August 18th. I documented the structural integrity of the main tunnels, noted some minor degradation in the support beams, and recommended permanent sealing of the eastern drift due to geological instability. I said nothing about the hidden tunnel or the chamber or what I'd found there, but I started doing research, digging through historical records at the provincial archives in Edmonton. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about the Atlas coal mine. In 1957, 2 years before the mine's official opening, there was a 3-month period where all operations mysteriously stopped. The company records from that time are heavily redacted, but I found personal correspondence from one of the mining engineers that suggested they'd hit something while drilling an exploratory shaft. Something he described as not coal and not like anything else we've ever seen. The drilling crew refused to continue. New workers were brought in from outside the area, men with no mining experience, and the entire section was sealed with concrete and steel reinforcement that had nothing to do with coal extraction. The Atlas coal mine wasn't built to extract coal from that area. It was built around something that was already there, something they found and couldn't explain and desperately wanted to contain. The mine operated for 22 years, producing coal from other sections, but that eastern drift was always sealed, always restricted. And now I understand why. The coal company found something in 1957, something that had been buried under the Badlands for longer than human civilization, something that exists in geometries our minds can't process and communicates in frequencies that bypass consciousness entirely. I quit my job with Parks Canada 3 weeks after I left Drumheller. I told them it was for personal reasons, and they didn't push for details. I now work as a structural consultant for commercial buildings in Calgary, nice, simple projects, where everything follows Euclidean geometry, and the corners meet the way they're supposed to. But I still think about that chamber, about those 4 missing hours, about the colors that don't exist, and the sounds below hearing that my equipment recorded. Most of all, I think about the fact that my report ensured that section will be permanently sealed, which means no one else will go down there. But it also means that whatever is in that chamber is still there, waiting in the dark beneath Drumheller, existing in spaces that reality doesn't quite touch. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's still aware of me, if some part of my consciousness is still down there, in that impossible room, stuck in those 4 hours I can't remember, listening to frequencies that were never meant for human ears. My name is Sarah, and in November 2001, I took a job that taught me some agreements should never be made, and some traditions exist because breaking them costs more than anyone should pay. I was 28 years old, working seasonal ranch jobs across Alberta, and I'd answered an ad for a sheep shearer and general ranch hand near Grande Cache. The pay was decent, room and board included, and the work sounded straightforward enough. I'd grown up around livestock, knew my way around sheep, and didn't mind the isolation of mountain country. The couple who hired me over the phone, Daryl and Crystal, said they'd been running the operation since 1974 and just needed extra help through the winter months. They sounded kind. A bit tired, maybe, but genuine. What they didn't mention was why every single ranch hand quit before December, or what they'd been feeding to keep their flock safe for 27 years. I arrived on November 3rd, driving up a gravel road that wound through foothills, thick with spruce and pine. The ranch sat in a valley where the Rocky Mountains started their serious climb, bordered on three sides by crown land that stretched for miles without another human structure. The property was bigger than I expected, maybe 300 acres of grazing land, with a solid main house, 2 barns, and fencing that looked meticulously maintained. Daryl met me at the truck, a man in his early 70s with the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of outdoor work. He shook my hand with a firm grip and helped carry my bags inside, where Crystal had coffee waiting. She was probably 68 or so, sharp-eyed and quiet, watching me in a way that felt like assessment rather than welcome. The first 2 weeks passed without incident. The work was exactly what I expected. Feeding the flock of about 400 sheep, maintaining fences, mucking out barns, general property upkeep. Daryl and Crystal ran a tight operation, everything organized and efficient. The sheep were healthy, well-fed, and notably calm for a flock that size. What struck me as unusual was the absolute absence of predator problems. We were surrounded by wilderness that definitely held wolves, cougars, and bears, yet the ranch had never lost a single sheep to predation. When I mentioned this to Daryl one evening over dinner, he just nodded and said they'd been blessed with good fortune. Crystal gave him a sharp look across the table, and the conversation ended there. I started noticing the symbols around the 3rd week. They were carved into the fence posts at the property boundaries, worn smooth by weather and age, but still clearly deliberate. The designs weren't anything I recognized, not ranch brands or survey markers. They looked older than that, more primitive. Circles within circles, lines that spiraled inward, shapes that reminded me of things I'd seen in books about indigenous art, but weren't quite the same. Every fence post along the northern boundary had one, carved deep into the wood. Some of the posts were clearly original to the property, dating back decades based on the wood's condition. Others were newer replacements, but someone had carefully recarved the symbols to match. On November 18th, I asked Crystal about them while we were sorting wool in the barn. She stopped working and looked at me for a long moment, her hands still buried in the fleece. Then she said the symbols were protection, that Daryl's family had learned about them from people who'd worked this land long before white settlers arrived. She said they were older than the ranch, older than Grande Cache itself, and they kept the mountain's attention elsewhere. I asked what she meant by the mountain's attention, and she went back to sorting wool without answering. That night at dinner, Daryl mentioned that the previous ranch hand had lasted until November 23rd before deciding to leave. Something in the way he said it felt like a warning and a timeline both. The first snow came on November 21st, heavy wet flakes that blanketed everything by morning. I was feeding the flock when I noticed Daryl walking the northern fence line, checking each post carefully. Crystal was in the barn, gathering supplies that seemed unusual. A length of new rope, a bucket of what looked like rendered fat mixed with herbs, and a hunting knife that had clearly seen decades of use. When I asked if they needed help with something, Daryl said they had an annual task to complete, and I should stay in the main house that evening. His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. But I'd grown up on ranches where you pulled your weight and didn't hide from difficult work. So after they left around dusk, I followed at a distance. They walked north to where the property bordered a section of crown land, carrying one of the younger ewes. The sheep wasn't fighting, which seemed strange. They'd given it something, maybe, to keep it calm. The wind was blowing through the trees, and the temperature had dropped to well below freezing. I stayed back in the tree line, watching as they reached a massive spruce that must have been 200 years old or more. The trunk was scarred with the same symbols I'd seen on the fence posts, but older, deeper, carved into bark that had grown around them over decades. Daryl tied the ewe to the tree using the rope, securing it carefully. Crystal spread the fat mixture on the ground in a circle around the tree's base, and they both stood there for several minutes, not speaking, just waiting in the cold and the dark. Then they left. They just walked back toward the ranch buildings, leaving the ewe tied and bleeding softly in the November night. I stayed hidden, confused, and increasingly uneasy. The wind changed direction, and I smelled something on it that made my stomach turn. It wasn't quite rot and wasn't quite animal musk, something in between that didn't match anything I'd encountered before. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees in the span of minutes. The ewe stopped bleeding. Complete silence fell over the forest, the kind of quiet that feels wrong because wind doesn't stop and trees don't suddenly cease their creaking and no night birds call. Just absolute stillness that pressed against my ears like physical pressure. I didn't see what came for the ewe. The darkness between the trees became thicker somehow, more solid, and I had this overwhelming sense that staying there to watch would be the worst mistake of my life. Every instinct screamed at me to look away, to leave, to be anywhere but in that spot. So I ran. I ran back to the ranch house, my boots crunching through snow, my breath coming in frozen gasps. I burst through the door, and Daryl and Crystal were sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea like nothing had happened. They looked at me, and Crystal said simply that I'd been told to stay inside. Daryl added that some things were better left unwitnessed, that knowledge carried weight I didn't want to bear. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about that ewe, about the symbols, about the wrongness I'd felt in the forest. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and looked out the window toward the northern tree line. The ewe was gone. I took a flashlight and walked out at first light, telling myself I needed to see what had happened. The rope was still tied to the tree, severed cleanly about 2 feet from the trunk. The fat mixture Crystal had spread was gone. The ground where it had been was bare dirt with no snow cover. There were no tracks. Not from the sheep, not from wolves or cougars, not from anything. The area around the tree was completely undisturbed except for the missing ewe and the circle of bare ground. No blood, no wool, no signs of struggle. Just absence. That afternoon, I finally asked them directly what they'd done and why. Dariel and Crystal exchanged a long look, and then Dariel told me to sit down. He explained that his grandfather had bought this land in 1921 from a Métis trapper named Baptiste, who'd worked the area for 40 years before that. Baptiste told Dariel's grandfather about the thing that lived in the deep forest north of the property, something the indigenous peoples had known about for generations. It had no name they'd share, but it had an appetite and a territory. Baptiste's people had made an arrangement long ago, leave an offering at the old spruce when the first heavy snow came, and the thing would take only what was given. It would leave the herds alone, leave the people alone, and stay in its part of the forest where it belonged. Crystal said Dariel's family had maintained the agreement since 1921. Every November, when the first real snow fell, they brought a sheep to the tree. They'd done it for 80 years, and in 80 years, they'd never lost stock to predators. Not one sheep to wolves or cougars. Not one calf when they'd briefly run cattle in the 60s. Other ranches in the area lost animals regularly. Some had been forced out of business by predation, but not this property. Never this property. The price was 1 sheep per year, and in exchange, everything else was protected. Dariel's father had done it. Dariel's grandfather had done it. Now Dariel and Crystal continued the tradition, and someday, whoever took over the ranch would continue it too. I asked what would happen if they stopped. Crystal's face went hard and cold. She said Dariel's uncle had refused to make the offering in 1956. He thought it was superstition, thought the protection was just luck and careful management. That December, they lost 43 sheep in 2 weeks, not to normal predation. The animals were found torn apart in ways that didn't match any known predator, arranged in patterns, left in places that made no sense. Some were found inside locked barns. Dariel's uncle started seeing things in the windows at night, shapes that stood upright but weren't human. He started hearing his name called from the forest. On Christmas Eve, he walked into the tree line and never came back. They found his body in March when the snow melted, 3 miles into the Crown land, positioned under that same old spruce. Daryl was 16 then. He made the offering that next November, and every November since, and the death stopped immediately. I worked through the rest of November and into early December, but I couldn't shake what I'd learned. The ranch operated normally. The flock was healthy and safe. Daryl and Crystal went about their work with the steady calm of people who'd made peace with their arrangement decades ago. But I kept thinking about that thing in the forest, about what it meant that you could bargain with it, that it understood agreements and kept them. That suggested intelligence, intention, patience. Whatever lived north of the property line wasn't just an animal. It was something older, something that had learned to coexist with humans by establishing rules and expectations. I left on December 8th, told them I had family obligations in Edmonton. They didn't try to convince me to stay. Crystal hugged me goodbye and said I was a good worker, and Daryl shook my hand and thanked me for my help. As I drove away, I looked back once and saw them standing in the yard, 2 elderly people alone with their flock and their bargain, bound to that land and its requirements. I later learned from talking to other seasonal workers that everyone who worked that ranch left before winter fully set in. People sensed something off about the place, felt the weight of whatever agreement hung over that property, and found reasons to leave before they learned too much. I moved to Edmonton and found work that kept me in the city, away from isolated ranches and mountain valleys. But sometimes in November, when the first heavy snow falls, I think about Daryl and Crystal. They'd be in their 90s now, if they're still alive, still making that walk to the northern boundary, still maintaining an agreement that predates their family's ownership of the land. Their children never returned to take over the ranch. I asked around once and learned all 3 kids moved to cities far from Alberta, none of them willing to inherit the property and its obligations. Eventually, someone else will buy that land, probably someone who doesn't know about the arrangement, doesn't understand why the fence posts have symbols carved into them, or why the old spruce at the northern boundary is scarred with decades of markings. And I wonder what will happen when November comes and no offering is made, when the thing in the forest realizes the agreement has been broken not by choice, but by ignorance. Some traditions survive because they have to, because the alternative is worse than the cost of maintaining them. And sometimes the scariest thing about horror isn't what hunts us, but what we're willing to feed to keep it satisfied. Have you ever noticed protection symbols around old properties in your area, or heard stories about offerings that had to be maintained? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. My name is Taylor, and I've worked as a veterinary technician for 17 years. I've seen plenty of things that made me uncomfortable during necropsies and examinations, but nothing prepared me for what walked into our clinic in Vulcan on March 12, 2016. I specialized in large animal care, mostly cattle and horses, the kind of work that keeps rural Alberta ranching operations running. You develop a strong stomach in this profession, learn to compartmentalize the messier aspects of animal medicine, and accept that death is part of the cycle you're managing. But what I examined that spring violated every principle of biology I'd learned, and 5 years later, I still check my lab samples twice to make sure they're actually dead before I turn off the lights. The rancher's name was Luciano, a third-generation cattle operator whose family had worked land southeast of Vulcan since the 1950s. He'd called ahead that morning, said he had a dead calf with an unusual growth, and wanted our veterinarian to examine it before he disposed of the carcass. This wasn't uncommon. Ranchers needed to know if they were dealing with disease, genetic issues, or environmental factors that might affect the rest of their herd. Our vet was out on an emergency call, so I told Luciano I'd start the preliminary examination and documentation. He arrived around 10:30, backing his truck up to our facility's rear entrance where we handled the larger cases that couldn't fit on standard exam tables. The calf was maybe 3 months old Angus cross, which should have weighed around 200 pounds. Luciano had wrapped it in plastic sheeting, and when we unwrapped it in the necropsy suite, the smell hit me first. Not the usual odor of decomposition, but something chemical and oddly sweet, like industrial solvent mixed with overripe fruit. The calf had been dead approximately 18 hours, based on rigor mortis and Luciano's timeline. The growth he'd mentioned was located on the right hindquarter, a mass about the size of a grapefruit that looked like a tumor at first glance. But the texture was wrong. Tumors have a certain consistency, a specific way they integrate with surrounding tissue. This thing looked almost grafted on, like it had grown separately and then attached itself to the calf's body. I photographed everything from multiple angles, took the calf's measurements and weight, then began the external examination. The mass had a surface that seemed to shift between smooth and ridged depending on the angle of light. Under my gloved hands, it felt warmer than the surrounding dead tissue, which made no sense. Dead tissue doesn't generate heat. I made an initial incision to examine the mass's internal structure, and what I found made me stop and double-check my instruments. Inside, the growth had organized systems, not random tumor cells, but structures that resembled organs, tiny chambers that looked almost like hearts, branching pathways that mimicked blood, vessels, dense nodules that could have been primitive nervous tissue, except none of it matched any terrestrial animal anatomy I'd ever studied. The arrangement was wrong in fundamental ways. The symmetry was off, following patterns that biological systems don't use. Some chambers had valves that opened in directions that would make fluid flow impossible in normal physiology. The tissue colors ranged from deep purple to pale yellow-green, shades I'd never seen in organic matter. I collected samples using standard biopsy procedures, placing tissue sections in fixative solution for preservation and microscopic analysis. The samples went into our laboratory refrigerator, properly labeled and documented. Then I completed the full necropsy on the calf itself, searching for any other abnormalities or clues about what might have caused this growth. The rest of the calf appeared completely normal. Healthy organ development, no signs of disease, good muscle mass and bone structure. Whatever this growth was, it hadn't affected the animal's overall health until recently. Luciano told me the calf had been acting normally up until 2 days before death, then suddenly became lethargic and stopped nursing. I asked about the grazing areas, any unusual environmental factors. He mentioned his cattle had been on pasture that bordered an old military testing range from the Cold War era. The land had been declared safe decades ago, opened up for agricultural lease, and his family had grazed cattle there since the early 1990s without incident, until now. I prepared my preliminary report and told Luciano I'd send tissue samples to the University of Alberta for analysis. He seemed anxious, kept asking if this could spread to his other cattle, if he should be worried about the rest of his herd. I couldn't give him answers because I genuinely didn't know what we were dealing with. I recommended he monitor his animals closely and call immediately if any others showed unusual growths or symptoms. He left around 2 in the afternoon, and I settled in to examine the tissue samples under our clinic's microscope. What I saw in those samples still appears in my nightmares. The cells weren't dying. 18 hours post-mortem from the host animal, preserved in fixative solution that should have stopped all cellular activity, and these cells were still showing signs of life. Membranes were flexing, internal structures were moving, and most disturbing, some cells appeared to be attempting division. I watched for 40 minutes, documenting everything with our microscope's camera system, and the activity didn't slow down. If anything, it seemed to increase. Cells were reorganizing themselves, forming new structures, trying to replicate despite being cut off from any nutrient source and submerged in chemicals designed to preserve dead tissue. I called Dr. Andre, our senior veterinarian, and showed him the samples when he returned from his emergency call. He's been practicing for 32 years, taught veterinary pathology at the University of Saskatchewan before moving into private practice, and I watched his face go pale as he looked through the microscope. He asked me to prepare additional samples and increase the magnification. At higher power, we could see the cellular machinery operating in ways that violated basic biochemistry. These cells had markers that didn't exist in any known animal taxonomy. Some of the proteins fluoresced under UV light in patterns that suggested synthetic origin, but the tissue was definitely organic, definitely grown rather than manufactured. We packaged samples in 3 separate containment vessels and shipped them via courier to the University of Alberta's Veterinary Pathology Department that same evening. I included detailed documentation, photographs, and a note explaining we needed emergency analysis due to potential herd health implications. Then I went home, ate dinner without tasting it, and lay awake thinking about those cells that refused to die, that seemed almost purposeful in their continued activity. The university called back March 14th, 2 days later. Not the pathology department, but someone from their biosafety division. The woman on the phone was carefully professional, asked me detailed questions about collection procedures, containment protocols, and exposure risks. Then she asked where the samples had really come from. I told her they came from exactly where my documentation stated, a dead calf from a ranch near Vulcan. She paused for a long time before saying, the cellular markers in those samples indicated exposure to materials that shouldn't exist in agricultural settings. Some of the compounds present in the tissue matched signatures from experimental biological research conducted in the 1960s and 70s. Research that had been discontinued and supposedly fully remediated. She wouldn't elaborate further, said someone would contact me with protocols for handling any additional cases. Then she asked if I still had samples at my clinic. I confirmed we had the original tissue sections in our refrigerator. She recommended I check on them immediately. I was still at home, so I drove back to the clinic even though it was nearly 8 at night. When I opened the laboratory refrigerator, the containers with the tissue samples were clouded. The fixative solution had turned milky white, and the tissue inside had grown. The grape-sized samples I'd collected were now roughly the size of plums, pressing against the container walls, and when I held one up to the light, I could see movement inside. The cells weren't just staying alive, they were thriving, multiplying, building more complex structures, even in complete isolation from any host organism. I called the university contact back immediately. Within 6 hours, a team arrived at my clinic with biohazard containment equipment and paperwork, classifying the samples under some federal biosafety protocol I'd never heard of. They removed all tissue samples, the instruments I'd used, even the microscope. They made me sign documentation agreeing not to discuss the specific cellular findings. One of the team members, a man who introduced himself only as a federal agricultural inspector, told me that certain areas in southern Alberta had residual contamination from Cold War-era research into biological agents meant to enhance livestock growth and disease resistance. Most of it had degraded harmlessly over decades, but occasionally environmental conditions activated dormant compounds in the soil. What we'd found wasn't naturally occurring, and it wasn't supposed to be possible anymore. March 16th, Luciano called me from a veterinary clinic in Lethbridge. 3 more calves had been born with similar growths over the past 2 days. He'd been contacted by federal agriculture officials who'd quarantined his entire herd and were arranging to purchase all his cattle at premium prices. He was being relocated to different grazing land, and the pasture near the old military range was being permanently closed to agricultural use. He wanted to know what was really happening, but I couldn't tell him anything beyond what I'd already reported. The conversation ended with him saying he'd been ranching that land for 12 years, and now suddenly it was too dangerous to use, and nobody would explain why. I returned to my regular work, but things felt different. Every biopsy sample, every tissue collection, every necropsy made me hyper-aware of cellular behavior. I started checking samples hours after collection, verifying that dead tissue was actually staying dead. Most of the time, everything was normal. Cells degraded according to expected timelines. Nothing unusual appeared under the microscope. But I developed this compulsive need to verify, this constant low-level anxiety that I might encounter another sample that wouldn't follow the rules, that would keep living and growing and building structures that biological matter shouldn't be capable of creating. About 6 months later, I read a brief article in an agricultural industry newsletter about similar incidents in Saskatchewan in 1987 and Manitoba in 1992. In both cases, cattle near former government research facilities developed unusual growths, entire herds were destroyed, and the land was removed from agricultural use. The pattern was clear if you knew to look for it. Experimental biological research from decades ago, inadequately contained or remediated, occasionally surfacing when environmental conditions aligned correctly. Each time it happened, authorities responded with quarantine and silence, preferring to handle it quietly rather than admit what had been created and released into the environment decades earlier. I still work as a veterinary technician, still handle large animal cases across southern Alberta. But I'm more careful now about asking questions regarding where animals have been grazing, what land they've had access to. When ranchers mention pastures near old military facilities or abandoned research stations, I document it carefully. Most of the time, there's nothing to worry about. Most of the time, the tissue samples behave exactly as they should, dying properly and staying dead like nature intended. But sometimes late at night, I think about those cells I watched through the microscope. Cells that kept living hours after they should have stopped, that tried to build something more complex than they should have been capable of becoming. I think about what might have happened if that calf had lived longer, if that growth had continued developing, if whatever those Cold War researchers created had achieved whatever purpose they'd designed it for. And I'm grateful that some experiments fail before they succeed, even if their failures keep surfacing decades later in ways we're still trying to contain. What would you do if you discovered something in your work that nobody wanted to acknowledge existed? Let me know in the comments. My name is Caden, and I'm a civilian IT contractor working on Department of National Defense systems across Western Canada. Most of my work involves routine network infrastructure maintenance, upgrading outdated systems, and troubleshooting connectivity issues at various military installations. It's stable government contract work that pays well and usually presents zero excitement. In July 2022, I got assigned to Cold Lake Air Base in northeastern Alberta to address network complaints in some older housing units scheduled for demolition. The buildings, dated back to the early 1980s, were being emptied out as personnel moved to newer facilities, and within 6 months would be torn down completely. What I discovered in those buildings changed how I understand the relationship between data, time, and the physical infrastructure that carries information. I found footage that shouldn't exist, stored in a medium that can't hold data, showing events from decades ago that somehow knew what was happening in the present. I arrived at Cold Lake on July 8th, checked in with base security, and met with the housing office administrator who'd submitted the work orders. Residents in buildings 7 and 9 had been reporting strange network behavior for about 3 weeks. Their devices would occasionally detect an unknown Wi-Fi network that appeared and disappeared without pattern. The network name was showing up as Redacted 1987, which seemed like someone's idea of a joke, except none of the current residents had created it, and base IT couldn't locate any unauthorized routers or access points. Since the buildings were nearly empty anyway, it hadn't been priority. But protocol required investigation before demolition, in case there was equipment that needed proper decommissioning. Building 7 was a 3-story structure with apartments that had housed junior officers and their families since 1982. Most units were vacant now, furniture removed, just empty rooms with old carpet and that particular smell of abandoned military housing. I started in the basement where the main network junction boxes were located, checking for any unauthorized equipment or unusual configurations. Everything looked standard, exactly what I'd expect for a building of that era that had been retrofitted with modern Ethernet around 2008. No rogue routers, no hidden access points, no obvious source for a phantom Wi-Fi network. I went unit to unit on the second floor, using spectrum analysis equipment to detect any radio frequency emissions that might explain the mysterious network. Around 2 in the afternoon, my equipment picked up a strong signal in Unit 2B. The network, redacted 1987, was broadcasting actively, showing full signal strength. But my analyzer couldn't identify the source location. The signal seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, diffused throughout the unit's walls rather than emanating from a single point. I'd never seen anything like it. Wi-Fi. Signals have directionality. You can trace them to their origin point, but this signal had no clear source, despite being strong enough that my laptop was prompting me to connect. Against every security protocol I'd been trained to follow, I connected to the network. No password required, just open access. My laptop established connection immediately, and I expected to find either nothing or some prank setup. Instead, my network traffic analysis showed active data transmission. The network was serving content, pushing a continuous stream of information that my system was receiving, whether I'd requested it or not. I opened my packet capture software to examine what was being transmitted. The data was formatted as video stream, compressed using a codec from the early 1990s, fragmented in a way that suggested it had been stored improperly or degraded over time. I spent the next hour reconstructing the video data, piecing together fragments, and error-correcting corrupted sections. What emerged was security camera footage, black and white, showing the hallway outside Unit 2B. The timestamp on the footage read November 3rd, 1987. The building had been constructed in 1982, and military housing definitely had basic security systems in that era. So old archived footage wasn't inherently strange. What was strange was where this footage was being stored. There were no servers in the building, no network-attached storage, no local storage devices anywhere. The video data was somehow embedded in the building's electrical wiring itself, stored as patterns of electromagnetic residue that my Wi-Fi equipment was detecting and interpreting as a network signal. I watched the footage, seeing people in late 1980s military uniforms walking through corridors, going about routine activities. Families entering and exiting apartments, personnel checking mail, children playing in the hallway. Everything looked normal for archived security footage, except the movement patterns were slightly off. People walked with odd timing, turned corners at angles that didn't quite match their stride patterns, stood still for fractionally too long before continuing motion. It felt like watching video that had been edited poorly, with frames removed or duplicated, except the footage was supposedly continuous. Then I noticed the timestamp. It was updating. The video showed November 3rd, 1987, but the seconds were counting forward in real time, synchronized with my laptop's clock. The footage was somehow live despite showing events from 35 years ago. I checked my system time, verified it was correct, then watched as the archived footage timestamp advanced second by second, matching current time perfectly. This violated basic logic. Archived footage has a fixed timestamp, a record of when events occurred. This footage was claiming to be from 1987 while simultaneously existing in the present moment. I tested something. I walked into the hallway outside Unit 2B and coughed loudly 3 times. Then I went back inside and reviewed the video footage from November 3rd, 1987, at the exact timestamp corresponding to 30 seconds prior. In the footage, a figure appeared in the hallway that hadn't been there during my first viewing. The figure stood in roughly the position where I'd just been standing. The image was degraded, pixelated beyond clear recognition, but the timing matched my actions exactly. The 1987 footage was incorporating events from 2022, integrating present-day occurrences into past-dated recordings as if time wasn't linear for this data stream. I called my supervisor, tried to explain what I was seeing, but describing temporal anomalies in video footage over the phone made me sound either incompetent or unstable. He told me to document everything, collect any physical evidence, and submit a full technical report. I spent the next 3 hours attempting exactly that. I backed up the video stream to 3 separate external drives, captured network traffic logs, photographed my spectrum analysis readings, and recorded detailed notes about the signal characteristics and impossible timestamp behavior. Every file I backed up corrupted within minutes of being moved off the local network. The video files would transfer successfully, verify with correct checksums, then become unreadable garbage data when I tried to access them. Network logs degraded into random characters. Screenshots became solid gray squares. The data existed only while connected to that specific building's infrastructure. Remove it from that physical location, and it ceased to maintain coherence. Whatever was storing this information, it was inseparable from the building itself. I examined the electrical system more carefully, pulling apart junction boxes and tracing wire runs. The building had been rewired partially in 1993 and again in 2008, but sections of the original 1982 electrical infrastructure remained, particularly in the walls where security cameras had been mounted. The old coaxial cables that had carried video signals from those cameras were still present, disconnected but in place, running through the walls like a dormant nervous system. Those cables were acting as antennas, picking up electromagnetic patterns that had somehow been imprinted into the building structure decades ago and resonating with current electrical activity to recreate video signals. The theoretical framework for this was barely plausible. Electrical systems can retain residual electromagnetic patterns under specific conditions. Old tape recording studios sometimes pick up ghostly traces of previous recordings bleeding through from magnetic residue in their equipment. This seemed like a vastly more complex version of that phenomenon. The building's entire electrical infrastructure had somehow become a storage medium for video data, holding patterns of information in the electromagnetic fields generated by decades of electrical current flow. And those patterns were interacting with present-day electrical activity, creating a bridge where past and present existed simultaneously within the same data stream. July 10th, 2 days after my initial discovery, I was contacted by base security and told to report to the command building immediately. I met with 2 officers whose names I never learned and a civilian who introduced himself only as a D&D technical oversight specialist. They asked detailed questions about my investigation, what I'd found, what I'd documented, who I'd discussed it with. I told them everything truthfully. The civilian specialist explained that Building 7 had housed intelligence personnel in the 1980s who'd worked with experimental surveillance systems. Some of those systems had unexpected side effects, particularly regarding data persistence in non-standard storage media. The issue had been studied extensively in the early 1990s and was considered a closed matter. Except, clearly it wasn't closed. The civilian admitted that temporal data anomalies had been observed at several facilities where these experimental surveillance systems had been installed. In most cases, the effect was subtle enough to be dismissed as equipment malfunction or interpretation error. Building 7 was scheduled for demolition, specifically because the effect had intensified over time rather than degrading. They'd learned that once physical infrastructure became imprinted with these temporal data patterns, the phenomenon was permanent and would continue as long as the structure remained intact and electrically active. I asked what the military had been trying to accomplish with surveillance systems that could store data in electromagnetic patterns within building infrastructure. The civilian gave me a look that said I'd asked a question I shouldn't have, but then answered anyway. During the Cold War, there was significant research into surveillance methods that couldn't be detected or removed through conventional means. Systems that didn't rely on physical storage media that could be seized or destroyed. The research succeeded beyond expectations, creating surveillance infrastructure that became inseparable from the buildings themselves. But the temporal side effects made the technology unusable for its intended purpose. They had me sign documentation that classified my findings and prohibited discussion of the technical details. Then they explained that Building 7 would be demolished on schedule, that the contractor had been specifically selected because their demolition method included complete electromagnetic discharge of all building materials before physical destruction. This would erase the data patterns, finally ending the temporal loop that had been running in those walls since 1987. I finished my contract at Cold Lake and returned to Calgary, back to routine network maintenance and standard troubleshooting. But I can't stop thinking about what I saw in that building. Data that existed outside normal time, footage that recorded the past while simultaneously capturing the present, information stored in the electromagnetic residue of buildings rather than in drives or servers. The implications are staggering. How many other buildings retain information this way? How many structures carry data patterns in their electrical systems, holding records of past events that could potentially interact with current activities? I've started paying attention to older buildings in different ways now. Places that have been continuously powered for decades, that have extensive electrical infrastructure, that were built during eras when experimental technology was being tested without full understanding of long-term effects. Sometimes in those buildings, when I'm running network diagnostics, I pick up signals that don't quite make sense. Brief fragments of data that seem to come from everywhere at once, timestamps that don't align with current date, electromagnetic patterns that suggest information storage where none should exist. Most of the time, it's just noise or equipment error, but sometimes I wonder if I'm detecting other buildings like Building 7, other structures carrying ghost data from decades past, other places where the boundaries between recorded history and present reality have become blurred in ways we never intended and can't easily undo. Drop a comment if you think old buildings could be storing information we don't know how to access yet. My name is Reese, and I've been a forestry ranger for the Alberta government since 1985. I'm Métis, grew up hearing stories from my grandmother about things that walk in the deep woods, stories I always respected but never quite believed until January 1998. That winter taught me the difference between folklore passed down as cultural memory and folklore that exists because some truths are too dangerous to speak plainly. I spent 6 days in an isolated cabin in the Crowsnest Pass while something circled in the darkness outside, something that wore a human face I recognized but moved in ways that proved it wasn't human anymore. What walks in those mountains is still there, and the old warnings my grandmother taught me are the only reason I survived to tell anyone about it. January in the Rockies is serious business. Temperatures regularly drop to -40 Celsius. Snowpack builds to depths that make travel impossible without proper equipment, and the isolation becomes absolute when storms roll through. I'd volunteered for winter cabin duty at the Whitehorse Gulch Monitoring Station, a small forestry service structure about 30 kilometers south of Coleman. The cabin served as a base for avalanche monitoring, wildlife observation, and emergency shelter for backcountry users who got caught in bad weather. Most rangers avoided winter rotations because the solitude and cold could wear on you, but I'd always found peace in the winter forest. 15 previous winters, I'd done these rotations without incident, comfortable with the silence and the snow. I arrived at the cabin on January 11th by snowmobile, hauling supplies for a 2-week stay. The structure was basic, but solid. One main room with a wood stove, bunks, radio equipment, and enough stored food and fuel to last a month if necessary. The forest around the cabin was thick spruce and pine, the kind of old growth that creates deep shadows even in daylight. My responsibilities were straightforward: monitor weather conditions, check automated sensors placed throughout the area, maintain radio contact with the district office in Blairmore, and document any significant wildlife activity. The work kept me busy during daylight hours, and the evenings were spent maintaining equipment, reading, and enjoying the particular quiet that only exists in winter wilderness far from human activity. The third night, January 13th, I heard the footsteps. It was around 11 at night. Temperature outside had dropped to -43, and I was preparing to sleep when I heard something walking through the snow outside the cabin. The pattern was wrong immediately. The stride length was too long, covering distance that would require 8 or 9 foot steps. The rhythm was uneven, not the consistent pattern of any animal I'd tracked in 20 years of forestry work. It circled the cabin slowly, and I could hear the snow crunching under weight, hear the breathing that accompanied the movement. The breathing was harsh and wet, like lungs struggling with fluid, like something sick or damaged trying to pull air. I didn't open the door or look out the windows. My grandmother's voice was in my head, recounting stories she'd learned from her grandmother, who'd learned them from generations before. Stories about things that walk like men but aren't men, that hunger in ways natural animals don't, that remember who they were while becoming something else entirely. She told me if I ever heard footsteps circling in winter darkness, footsteps with the wrong rhythm and wrong stride, I should stay inside, keep fire burning, and wait for daylight. So that's what I did. I fed the wood stove, kept the cabin warm and bright, and listened to that thing circle for 40 minutes before it moved away into the forest. Morning came with clear skies and brutal cold. I geared up and went outside to examine the tracks. What I found made my hands shake despite heavy gloves. The prints were humanoid, showing 5 toes and a heel structure, but elongated grotesquely. Each footprint was roughly 14 inches long, narrow, and showed signs of severe frostbite or necrosis in the impression pattern. The tissue that made these prints was damaged, deteriorating but still supporting weight and movement. The stride length measured between 8 and 9 feet consistently. Whatever made these tracks was tall, bipedal, and moving through -40-degree weather without any sign of normal footwear or protection. I followed the tracks for about 100 meters. They led deeper into the forest, passing through areas where the creature had stopped and stood still, apparently watching the cabin from different positions. At one point, the tracks approached within 10 feet of the cabin's east window, where it must have looked directly inside while I was sitting at the radio desk earlier that evening. The realization that this thing had been watching me before it started circling made my skin crawl in ways the cold couldn't explain. I radioed the district office, reported unusual wildlife activity without going into specific details, and asked if there'd been any reports of missing persons in the area recently. The dispatcher checked records and told me a hiker from Calgary had gone missing 2 weeks prior, last seen on a trail about 15 kilometers south of my location. The search had been called off after 8 days due to weather conditions and low probability of survival. The hiker's name was never mentioned during our radio conversation, but something about the timing made me uneasy. That afternoon, I dug through the cabin's record logs, reading entries from previous rangers dating back to the cabin's construction in 1976. Several entries mentioned unusual tracks, strange sounds at night, and a general unease during winter months. One entry from January 1981 described circumstances nearly identical to mine. Something circling the cabin at night, tracks that didn't match any known animal, a missing hiker who'd never been found. The ranger who wrote that entry noted he'd left 3 days early, requesting emergency extraction due to equipment failure that the log showed never actually occurred. The thing returned the second night, closer this time. I heard it approach around 10, moving through the forest with that same uneven gait. This time it didn't just circle. It came to the door and stopped there. I heard breathing on the other side of the wood, heard something that might have been sniffing or tasting the air. Then I heard a sound that made my blood freeze colder than the temperature outside. It spoke. Not words exactly, but vocalizations that had the rhythm of human speech. Like someone trying to remember how language worked, but managing only approximations. The sounds were wrong pitch, wrong tone, wrong everything, but the attempt at communication was undeniable. I sat absolutely still, hand on the rifle I'd brought for emergency wildlife encounters, knowing the weapon would be useless against whatever stood outside that door. The breathing continued for nearly 10 minutes. Then I heard it move away, not leaving, but repositioning. I risked looking through the window and saw it briefly in moonlight, before my mind tried to reject the image. The thing was impossibly tall, maybe 7.5 feet, emaciated to the point where I could see bone structure clearly through what remained of its skin. It moved with joints that bent wrong, too many articulation points in its limbs, like the skeleton had been altered or broken and healed incorrectly multiple times. But the face is what destroyed any doubt about what I was seeing. Even at that distance, even partially turned away, I recognized the features. I'd seen this person's photograph in the missing hiker report that had been posted at the ranger station in December. The facial structure was the same, but transformed. The eyes were wrong, reflecting light like an animal's eyes, and the expression held nothing human, despite the recognizable features. I knew then what my grandmother had tried to warn me about. This was what happened when people died wrong in these mountains. When they died alone and hungry and desperate. When some combination of circumstance and location and old power that predated human settlement transformed death into something else. The Cree called it by one name, the Ojibwe by another, but my grandmother's Métis ancestors had known it simply as the thing that walks hungry, the thing that used to be human and remembers being human but can't be human anymore. The third night, I prepared differently. I didn't have the materials for proper ceremony, but I had tobacco, and I had knowledge my grandmother had insisted I learn, even when I thought it was just cultural tradition without practical application. I built up the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm. I took tobacco from my personal supply and placed it in a small bowl near the door. Then I spoke words my grandmother had taught me. Old words in a language that mixed French and Cree and something older than both. I spoke to the thing outside, acknowledged what it had been, acknowledged what it had become, and offered it the respect of recognition without invitation. The breathing outside the door changed rhythm. I heard the thing move back from the cabin. Then I heard it vocalize again, those almost words that wanted to be speech, but this time the sound seemed less aggressive, more mournful. It stayed near the cabin but didn't approach the door again. I heard it moving in the forest, pacing through the trees, occasionally making sounds that could have been attempts at crying, if something without human vocal cords tried to weep. Morning of the fourth day, I found the tracks again, dozens of them. The thing had walked complex patterns through the forest around the cabin, covering the same ground repeatedly like it was trapped in some kind of loop. But it hadn't tried to force entry, hadn't scratched at the walls or windows, had kept its distance from the door where I'd placed the tobacco offering. The tracks led away finally, heading northwest into deeper wilderness, into areas where the forest becomes truly trackless, and the mountains rise in ways that make human passage nearly impossible. I completed my rotation, but requested early extraction on day 8, citing weather concerns. My supervisor approved without question. Before I left, I documented everything in the cabin log, knowing future rangers needed to understand what might visit during winter months, What knowledge might keep them safe if they encountered something that used to be human, but had changed into something else? I still work for Alberta Forestry, but I avoid winter cabin rotations in the Crowsnest Pass. Other rangers take those assignments, and most complete them without incident. But every few years, someone reports unusual tracks, strange sounds at night, the feeling of being watched by something that stands upright but isn't human. And every few years, a hiker goes missing in winter and is never found. And I wonder if the thing I saw is still walking those mountains. If others have joined it. If the transformation continues whenever conditions align in terrible ways. My grandmother died in 2003, but before she passed, I told her about what I'd seen in Whitehorse Gulch. She nodded like she'd expected this, like she'd known the stories would eventually become my experience, rather than just tradition passed down. She reminded me that the old knowledge exists for reasons, that some things in these forests are older than the forests themselves, and that respect and recognition can protect when weapons and walls cannot. She said the thing I'd seen was trapped between what it was and what it became, unable to die properly or live properly, existing in hunger and memory and cold that goes deeper than weather. I keep tobacco in my gear now, always, when I'm in the backcountry, especially in winter, especially in the older forests where human presence is minimal. I make small offerings and speak the words my grandmother taught me. Not because I fear encountering that thing again, but because I understand now that the boundary between human and other is thinner than I believed. And in the right conditions, under the wrong circumstances, any of us could cross it and never find our way back. Tell me in the comments if you think hunger can change what someone is at a fundamental level, or if you've seen tracks that made no sense in wilderness areas. My name is Alyssa, and for 11 months in 2013, I worked as a camp administrator at an oil sands operation near Slave Lake in northern Alberta. These industrial camps house hundreds of workers in remote locations, providing everything from meals to recreation to medical services. My job involved logistics coordination, scheduling, supply management, and general oversight of daily operations for a population that averaged 200 people living in temporary structures far from any real town. The work was demanding but straightforward, requiring organizational skills and attention to detail more than anything else. What I discovered during those months challenged my understanding of human behavior, free will, and whether the choices we make are actually ours. I'm still not certain if what I observed was real surveillance and control, a psychological breakdown on my part, or something far worse. Proof that human consciousness operates on predictable patterns we're not aware of, and certain environments can make those patterns visible. I arrived at the camp on October 8, 2013, replacing an administrator who'd quit abruptly after only 6 weeks. The camp operations manager who hired me mentioned the previous person had cited stress and isolation as reasons for leaving, which wasn't unusual for these positions. The work camps attract people who can handle remote living, but not everyone adapts successfully. The facility itself was standard for the industry. Modular buildings arranged in efficient grids, central dining hall, recreation areas, sleeping quarters organized by shift rotation, all connected by covered walkways to manage winter weather. Everything designed for maximum efficiency and minimum wasted space or movement. The first 3 weeks were busy with orientation and learning the administrative systems. I coordinated meal services for 3 daily shifts, managed supply deliveries, processed time cards, handled minor disputes between workers, and maintained communication with the company's regional office. The camp population was stable, mostly experienced tradespeople and equipment operators working 21-day rotations followed by a week off. Everyone knew their jobs, followed established routines, and the operation ran smoothly without much intervention needed from administration. Around the 4th week, I started noticing coincidences in timing. Small things initially. I'd walk to the dining hall and encounter the same 3 people every time, arriving from different directions but converging at the entrance within seconds of each other. Coffee would run out in the break room at almost exactly the same time each shift, requiring refills on a schedule that seemed too precise for random consumption. Workers would finish their meals and stand to leave in clusters, not obviously coordinated but statistically unlikely to occur naturally with that consistency. I began documenting these observations in early November, keeping notes on timing patterns and behavioral repetition. The coffee consumption stood out particularly. Over a 5-day period, the main break room required coffee refills at 6:47 a.m., 10:23 a.m., 2:19 p.m., and 7:35 p.m. daily, within a 2-minute variance. For 200 people making individual decisions about when to pour coffee, that level of consistency defied probability. Bathroom usage showed similar patterns. The facilities required cleaning on a predictable schedule that suggested people were using them in synchronized waves rather than continuously throughout shifts. I started tracking my own behavior, writing down when I made specific choices, when I checked email, when I walked to the supply office, when I ate lunch. After 10 days of documentation, I noticed my own actions followed patterns I hadn't consciously created. I checked email at 9:15 a.m. and 3:40 p.m. every day, variance under 3 minutes. I walked to the supply office at consistent intervals that matched my documentation from weeks prior. Even my meal choices showed repetition: chicken on Mondays and Thursdays, beef on Tuesdays and Fridays, fish on Wednesdays. I hadn't made deliberate decisions about this pattern. I thought I was choosing freely, but the documentation showed otherwise. I mentioned my observations to Manuel, one of the senior drilling supervisors, during a routine administrative meeting. I framed it casually, said I'd noticed people seemed to have predictable routines, and asked if he'd observed anything similar. His reaction was strange. He looked at me carefully, then said, "Workers in these camps develop habits because routine helps manage the psychological stress of isolated industrial work." His explanation was reasonable, but his expression suggested concern rather than agreement. After that conversation, I noticed Manuel watching me more often, appearing in areas where he didn't have obvious work reasons to be, always at specific times that I started recognizing after they repeated. I began researching the camp's history and company records I had access to through administrative systems. The facility had been constructed in 2010 on a site that previously held a different kind of installation. The land had been purchased from the provincial government, and prior to oil industry use, it appeared in records as a research facility operating from 1974 until 1989. The documentation about that earlier facility was minimal, mostly property transfer paperwork and environmental assessments. But one notation mentioned the previous structure's foundations had been incorporated into the current camp's construction to save costs and reduce environmental disruption. I found architectural plans for both the old facility and current camp in the digital archives. When I overlaid them, the building layouts aligned almost perfectly. The current sleeping quarters sat directly on foundations from the earlier facility's residential sections. The dining hall occupied the footprint of what the old plans labeled as a central observation area. The recreation building matched something called an integration space. The old facility's design focused on optimizing movement patterns and behavioral flow through architectural geometry, creating environments where people would naturally move and gather in specific ways. This discovery coincided with me experiencing something I can only describe as perfect clarity. It happened over 3 days in mid-November. I woke up on November 14th feeling different, like my perception had sharpened or expanded. I could see the patterns everywhere, suddenly, not just in my documentation, but in real time as they happened. I watched workers move through the camp and could predict their paths before they chose them. I knew when someone would stop to talk, when they'd check their phone, When they'd change direction, the behavior wasn't random. It followed mathematical distributions that were too perfect, too clean. During those 3 days, I understood that humans are pattern-executing machines pretending to have free will. Our brains process environmental inputs and generate behavioral outputs based on optimization algorithms we're not consciously aware of. The camp's geometry, built on foundations designed specifically to study and influence these patterns, was making them visible. The architectural spaces created subtle pressures on movement and decision-making, channeling behavior into predictable flows the same way water follows paths of least resistance. Everyone in the camp was operating within these optimized patterns, including me. And normally we'd never notice because the patterns feel like choices from the inside. I wrote extensive documentation during this period of clarity, filling notebooks with observations about behavioral mathematics, architectural influence on decision trees, and the horrifying elegance of deterministic human action masked as agency. I explained how the camp's design created a closed system where all variables could be mapped and predicted. I described how my own resistance to the patterns was itself predictable, how my documentation and research followed trajectories that someone studying behavioral optimization would expect an administrator to follow upon noticing the systematic nature of camp operations. Then the clarity faded. On November 17th, I woke up feeling normal again, and when I read my notebooks from the previous 3 days, the content disturbed me deeply. The observations were detailed and internally consistent, but they reflected thinking patterns that suggested psychological instability. I'd written about free will as illusion, about architecture controlling consciousness, about everyone in the camp being puppets following scripts determined by environmental geometry. This was paranoid thinking, the kind of ideation that indicates someone needs mental health intervention. I scheduled time off, told the operations manager I needed to visit family in Edmonton for personal reasons. He approved immediately, which seemed appropriate at the time but later felt too easy, too expected. I left the camp on November 19th and spent a week in Edmonton trying to process what I'd experienced. Away from the camp, surrounded by urban randomness and genuine chaos, I felt better. People moved unpredictably, made surprising choices, behaved in ways I couldn't forecast. The perfect patterns didn't exist in Edmonton. I concluded I'd experienced some kind of stress-induced episode triggered by isolation and overwork. I returned to the camp on November 26th, determined to approach my job normally, without obsessive documentation or pattern analysis. For 2 weeks, I succeeded. I performed my duties, didn't track timing or behavioral repetition, ignored the small coincidences that had initially captured my attention. Life in the camp felt routine and unremarkable. Then on December 10th, I noticed something that made all my previous observations flood back with renewed intensity. I was reviewing security footage for an unrelated incident when I noticed my own movement through the camp. The footage showed me walking from my office to the dining hall at exactly 11:47 a.m., the same path I'd walked dozens of times. But this footage was from October 15th, before I'd started documenting patterns, before I'd become consciously aware of behavioral repetition. I pulled footage from other dates, October 22nd, November 5th, November 28th, December 9th. Every instance showed me taking the same path, leaving my office at times that varied by less than 4 minutes, arriving at the dining hall having made identical routing choices through the camp's walkway system. I'd thought my patterns emerged after I started noticing them, but the footage proved otherwise. I'd been following precise behavioral scripts for my first week in the camp, long before I became aware enough to feel like I was choosing my actions consciously. The documentation I'd created hadn't changed my behavior. It had just made me aware of programming that was already running. I quit my job on December 13th, submitted immediate resignation, citing family medical issues that required my permanent presence in Edmonton. The operations manager accepted without question and processed my departure paperwork quickly. I moved to Edmonton, found work in office administration for a property management company, deliberately chose an industry far removed from remote industrial camps. But the patterns didn't stop. In Edmonton, in my new job, in my daily life away from that camp near Slave Lake, I still see them. I still catch myself making choices that follow mathematical distributions, still notice my behavior aligning with optimal paths through environmental constraints. I track when I make coffee, when I check email, when I choose specific routes to work. The patterns are there, slightly more variable than they were in the camp, but still present, still predictable if I document them carefully. Enough. This leaves me with 3 possible explanations, and I genuinely cannot determine which is correct. First possibility. The camp near Slave Lake had some genuine surveillance or control system built into its architecture, something left over from the 1970s research facility, and being exposed to it permanently altered my perception or psychological state. Second possibility. I experienced a mental health crisis triggered by isolation and stress, and the paranoid thinking patterns it created never fully resolved, leaving me trapped in a worldview where I see control and determination everywhere. Third possibility. What I observed was true. Humans do operate on predictable behavioral algorithms, and most people never notice because the patterns feel like free will from inside our own consciousness. But somehow I became aware and now cannot return to comfortable ignorance. I don't know which explanation is correct, and that uncertainty is worse than any definite answer could be. Sometimes I still experience periods of that perfect clarity, lasting hours or days, where I can see the behavioral mathematics operating beneath surface randomness. Then the clarity fades, and I'm left wondering if those moments represent truth or psychosis. I take the medication prescribed by my psychiatrist in Edmonton, attend therapy sessions focused on anxiety and paranoid ideation, maintain employment and normal social functioning. But I can't shake the feeling that either I'm still trapped in patterns determined by that camp's geometry, or I escaped the camp but learned something about human consciousness that makes genuine freedom impossible, or I'm mentally ill and none of my observations were ever real. The worst part is not knowing. The uncertainty itself follows me through every choice I make, every path I walk, every moment I think I'm deciding something freely, while documentation would probably show I'm following scripts optimized by environmental pressures I can't consciously detect. I still have the notebooks from my clarity period. I've hidden them where I won't accidentally read them, because the content either represents genuine insight that's too terrible to accept or evidence of psychological breakdown, and I genuinely cannot determine which. Would you trust your own mind if it showed you patterns that proved you weren't making free choices, or would you rather believe your consciousness was broken than accept that your will might be an illusion? Comment below. My name is Fernando, and I spent 3 years working as the overnight DJ at CJMM Community Radio in Canmore, Alberta. The job paid minimum wage, required staying awake through the coldest, loneliest hours of the night, and gave me creative freedom that larger stations would never allow. I played whatever music felt right, took calls from insomniacs and shift workers, and filled the mountain darkness with sound that connected people scattered across the Bow Valley. December 1995 was my final month at CJMM, and the incident that occurred on the night of December 18th is the reason I never worked in radio again. What interrupted our broadcast that night wasn't another station bleeding through our frequency or equipment malfunction. It was something that knew things it shouldn't know, that spoke with voices that included my own, and that proved certain infrastructure built during the Cold War left capabilities behind that were never meant to be discovered by civilians operating above their foundations. December the 18th started as a routine shift. I arrived at the station around 11:30, half an hour before midnight when my show began. Heavy snow was already falling, the kind of storm that drops wet, thick flakes, and piles up fast. Canmore sits in a valley where weather systems funnel through with intensity, and this storm had all the signs of being substantial. The previous DJ, a university student who handled the evening slot, mentioned the power had flickered twice during his shift, but the backup generator was tested and ready if needed. We had protocols for power failures, mostly involving the generator kicking in automatically and maintaining broadcast capability until municipal power restored. I settled into the booth, queued up my first set of music, and went live at midnight with my standard greeting. The show ran from midnight to 6 in the morning, 6 nights a week, serving an audience that I estimated at maybe 200 regular listeners scattered across Canmore, Banff, and the surrounding mountain communities. Truckers on Highway 1, hotel night staff, ski resort employees working graveyard shifts, people who couldn't sleep, people who found comfort in knowing someone was awake and talking in the darkness. I took requests, shared weather updates, played music that ranged from classic rock to obscure indie artists, and tried to make the hours between midnight and dawn feel less isolated for whoever was listening. Around 2 in the morning, the power failed. Not a flicker or brief interruption, but a complete loss that dropped the station into absolute darkness. The backup generator engaged within seconds, exactly as designed. Emergency lighting came up, and my equipment powered back on through the generator feed. I announced on air that we'd experienced a power interruption, but were operating normally on backup systems, encouraged listeners to stay safe in the storm, and continued with my playlist. The generator was loud enough that I could hear it running in the equipment room, a steady mechanical drone that became background noise within minutes. At exactly 3:47 in the morning, something interrupted our broadcast. I was mid-sentence, introducing a song request from a listener in Banff, when my voice cut out and was replaced by something else. The interruption wasn't external signal interference. It was coming from inside our broadcast, overlaying my audio at the source rather than bleeding in from another frequency. I could still hear myself in my headphones, could tell I was speaking, but what was going out over the air wasn't my voice anymore. The voice that replaced mine was flat, emotionless, mechanical, but not quite robotic. It had the tonal quality of human speech stripped of all inflection and personality. It began describing the station layout. The voice detailed the dimensions of the broadcast booth, the arrangement of equipment, the location of windows and doors, speaking with precision that suggested direct observation or access to architectural plans. Then it described me. It specified what I was wearing: black thermal shirt, jeans, work boots, the silver watch my father had given me. It described my posture, how I was leaning forward toward the microphone, the expression on my face as I listened to this impossible intrusion. Then the voice began describing my thoughts, not guessing or approximating, but stating internal observations I hadn't spoken aloud. It mentioned that I was confused about the interruption source, that I was reaching for the transmission controls to cut the broadcast, that I was wondering if this was equipment failure or deliberate interference. Every thought it described was accurate to what I was experiencing in that exact moment, as though something was reading my consciousness in real time and broadcasting the contents. I did cut the transmission, hitting the emergency shutdown that should have taken us completely off air. The equipment registered the shutdown. Indicators showed we were no longer broadcasting, but the voice continued in my headphones. It acknowledged my action, stated that I had activated the emergency protocol, and continued describing the station and my reactions with the same flat precision. The broadcast ran for 12 minutes total. The voice cataloging details about the equipment, the building, my personal history working at the station, and my moment-by-moment internal responses to what was happening. Then it shifted to a tone pattern, a series of high-pitched sounds that didn't match any emergency broadcast system I recognized. Canadian alert tones follow specific patterns that are immediately recognizable. This was different, more complex, almost like data transmission encoded as audio. The tone sequence lasted 43 seconds, then silence. Then my voice returned to the broadcast as though nothing had interrupted it. I finished the sentence I'd been speaking before the interruption, my audio, continuing seamlessly from where it had cut out. The phone lines immediately lit up with incoming calls. Within 3 minutes, I had 47 people trying to reach the station simultaneously. I took calls for the next hour, and every single person reported hearing the interruption. But their experiences varied in ways that made the incident far more disturbing than a simple broadcast anomaly. Each listener had heard personalized content. The voice had described their specific locations, their activities while listening, details about their homes or vehicles that should have been impossible for a radio broadcast to know. A trucker on Highway 1 near Lake Louise reported the voice had described the interior of his cab, specified the cargo he was hauling, and mentioned the photograph of his daughter. He kept clipped to his sun visor. A hotel night clerk in Banff said the voice had detailed the layout of her front desk, mentioned she was eating leftover pizza, and described the mystery novel she had opened beside her computer. Every caller had experienced this same phenomenon, the voice knowing things it couldn't possibly know and broadcasting that knowledge directly to them as though speaking to each individual listener personally, despite being a single transmitted signal. Several listeners had recording equipment running. 3 people had cassette decks that had captured the entire incident. They brought their recordings to the station later that day, and what we heard on those tapes was consistent but impossible. The voice on every recording was identical in content, but subtly different in characteristics. Audio analysis that we conducted later with borrowed equipment showed the voice was composite, multiple people speaking in perfect synchronization to create the impression of a single speaker. The analysis identified at least 17 distinct vocal sources layered together, including my own voice mixed into the composite at levels barely detectable without technical equipment. I called Cairo, the station manager, at his home around 5 in the morning once the initial flood of listener calls had subsided. He arrived at the station within 40 minutes despite the ongoing snowstorm and immediately began checking logs and equipment. His reaction to my description of the incident wasn't surprise or confusion. He went straight to the station's administrative files, pulled records that dated back to the station's founding in 1974, and started reading through entries I'd never seen before. CJMM had experienced identical incidents in 1977 and 1986, both times at 3:47 in the morning during overnight shifts, both times involving a voice that described things it shouldn't know and spoke with composite vocal characteristics. Both previous incidents had occurred exactly 9 years apart, and now in 1995, exactly 9 years after the last occurrence, it had happened again. Cairo showed me the documentation from those earlier events, incident, reports that matched my experience almost perfectly, including the detail about listeners receiving personalized content and the composite voice structure revealed through audio analysis. Cairo explained something he'd learned years earlier, but had hoped was historical rather than ongoing. The building that housed CJMM had been constructed on the foundation of a civil defense facility that operated from 1953 until 1972. During the Cold War, Canada established numerous monitoring and communication stations designed for various emergency scenarios. This particular facility had focused on broadcast capabilities, specifically testing methods for transmitting information across large areas using minimal infrastructure. When the civil defense program downsized in the early 70s, the facility was decommissioned, and the site eventually sold for commercial use. The current radio station used some of the original infrastructure, particularly the underground cabling, and certain transmission equipment that had been left in place, because removing it would have been expensive, and the equipment still functioned perfectly well for civilian radio purposes. Cairo believed, based on the 9-year cycle and the nature of the interruptions, that some automated system from the original civil defense facility remained active, triggering on a predetermined schedule and briefly asserting control over any broadcast equipment connected to the original infrastructure. The personalized content listeners heard suggested surveillance capabilities far beyond what should have been possible in 1950s technology, but Cold War research programs had explored numerous experimental approaches to communication and information gathering. Whatever system remained active beneath our station had access to information about listeners in real time, could synthesize that information into broadcast content, and could generate composite vocal transmissions that included audio samples from multiple sources, including current station personnel. Cairo told me the previous station manager had tried to investigate after the 1986 incident, attempting to locate and disconnect the Cold War-era equipment. He'd found extensive underground infrastructure that connected to systems extending well beyond the station's property boundaries. Attempting to trace or disable the equipment proved impossible without major excavation and technical expertise the station couldn't afford. The decision had been made to simply document the incidents and continue operations, operating on the assumption that a brief interruption every 9 years was manageable compared to the cost and complexity of full remediation. I worked my remaining shifts in December, but requested that Cairo find a replacement DJ for the overnight slot starting in January. I told him I was moving to Calgary for better opportunities, which was partially true, but the real reason was that I couldn't continue working in a facility where some remnant of Cold War infrastructure could assert control over my broadcast, where my voice could be sampled and used as part of composite transmissions without my consent, where listeners were being observed through mechanisms I couldn't see or understand. Before I left CJMEM, I calculated when the next incident would likely occur. 9 years from December 1995 would be December 2004. I don't know if it happened. I moved to Calgary, worked in construction and later in IT support, stayed away from radio and broadcast media entirely. But sometimes late at night, I think about that voice describing my thoughts in real time, about 17 vocal sources speaking in perfect unison, about systems built during the Cold War that apparently still function decades after their official decommissioning. I think about how much infrastructure from that era exists throughout Canada, how many facilities were built with capabilities that exceeded public knowledge, how many systems might remain active in foundations and underground installations that now support civilian operations completely unaware of what lies beneath them. The scariest part isn't that it happened. The scariest part is the 9-year cycle, the predictability, the implication that this isn't malfunction or accident, but programmed behavior executing according to design specifications created decades ago by people who built surveillance and broadcast capabilities into infrastructure without documenting it for future users. Somewhere in Canada, probably in multiple locations, Cold War-era systems are still running, still executing their original programming, still capable of asserting control over modern equipment built on top of their foundations. And most of the time, we have no idea they're there until they decide to make themselves known. If you worked in radio or emergency services, did you ever experience broadcasts that came from nowhere, or hear voices that seemed to know impossible details? Share your story below. My name is Anna, and I work as an agronomist specializing in drought-resistant crop development for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. My research focuses on creating wheat varieties that can survive increasingly unpredictable prairie weather patterns, extending growing seasons into drier conditions, and maintaining yield stability when rainfall becomes unreliable. In May 2008, I was assigned to assess a greenhouse facility in Vegreville, that had been sitting unused since the mid-1990s. The building was scheduled for renovation and repurposing for new drought-resistance trials my team had planned for the upcoming season. What I found inside that greenhouse wasn't abandoned infrastructure waiting for new projects. It was something that had continued growing for 18 years without human intervention, something that had solved the exact problems my research targeted, but had evolved solutions that violated every principle of controlled agricultural development. I discovered what happens when genetic modification succeeds too well, when plants optimize themselves beyond the parameters humans intended, and when success becomes indistinguishable from invasion. I arrived at the Vegreville Research Station on May 6, 2008, driving out from the main campus in Edmonton, where our primary laboratories were located. The facility had been a significant research hub during the 1980s and early 90s, when genetically modified crop development was rapidly expanding. Budget cuts and consolidation had moved most operations to larger centers, leaving the Vegreville station with minimal staff maintaining only the essential growing fields. The greenhouse I'd been sent to evaluate sat at the eastern edge of the property, a standard agricultural structure maybe 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with opaque panels that had weathered to a dingy white over years of neglect. The facility manager, a man named Colson, who'd worked at the station since 1995, gave me the access keys and mentioned the greenhouse had been sealed after the last GMO wheat trials concluded in 1990. He said they'd shut it down when funding shifted away from that particular research direction, and it had been easier to leave the structure intact rather than pay for proper decommissioning and cleanup. He seemed slightly uncomfortable discussing it, mentioned that previous managers had talked about strange smells coming from the building during warm weather, but nobody had bothered investigating since the structure wasn't needed and wasn't causing problems. I unlocked the greenhouse door, expecting to find empty growing benches, maybe some deteriorated equipment, possibly signs of water damage or animal intrusion. Instead, I found an environment that was thriving. The interior was warm and humid despite no climate control systems operating. The air was thick with the smell of growth, that earthy vegetative scent that healthy plants produce, but concentrated to an almost overwhelming degree. And the greenhouse wasn't empty. Every growing bench, every available surface was covered with plant growth that was clearly wheat-derived, but profoundly wrong in ways I recognized immediately as someone who'd spent 15 years studying cereal crop biology. The plants reached nearly to the greenhouse ceiling, far taller than any wheat variety should grow. The stems were hollow, but unusually thick, and when I examined them closely, I could see they were pulsing slightly, like there was fluid moving through them with pressure that exceeded normal xylem flow. The leaves were broader than standard wheat, with a waxy coating that gave them an almost plastic appearance. The grain heads were the most disturbing feature. They were swollen to twice normal size, and the individual kernels seemed to be moving, shifting position within the seed head in ways that suggested the contents were active rather than dormant. I checked for any possible water source, any explanation for how these plants had survived 18 years without irrigation or human care. The greenhouse's plumbing had been disconnected during the shutdown. There was no standing water, no moisture source, except whatever the plants could extract from air humidity and whatever root systems they'd developed. When I examined the growing benches, I found the roots had broken through the containers and penetrated directly into the concrete foundation beneath. The roots had actually cracked the concrete and pushed into the soil below the greenhouse structure, accessing groundwater and nutrients directly from the earth in ways that annual wheat plants shouldn't be capable of achieving. I collected samples carefully, wearing gloves and using sterile collection equipment. The plant tissue felt wrong under my hands, too firm, too warm, with a texture that reminded me more of synthetic materials than organic plant matter. I took stem sections, leaf samples, and most importantly, several of the grain heads with their oddly active kernels. Everything went into labeled specimen bags, and I transported them back to my vehicle for examination at the Edmonton laboratory. That evening, I examined the seed samples under microscopic magnification. What I found inside those kernels rewrote my understanding of what the 1990s researchers had actually created. The seeds weren't just wheat anymore. They contained a complete microscopic ecosystem. Inside each kernel were layers of different organism types, some recognizable as plant cells, but others that appeared bacterial, fungal, and completely unidentifiable. These organisms existed in symbiotic relationships, each type serving functions that supported the others. Some extracted moisture from air with efficiency that exceeded any known biological process. Others fixed nitrogen directly from atmospheric sources without requiring root nodule bacteria. Still others appeared to synthesize nutrients from trace elements, creating complete nutrition from minimal inputs. The seeds had evolved into self-sustaining biological packages that could germinate and grow in almost any conditions. They didn't need irrigation because they pulled moisture from air humidity with near-perfect efficiency. They didn't need fertilizer because they manufactured their own nutrients from atmospheric gases and trace minerals. They didn't need pest control because they'd developed chemical defenses that made them inedible to insects and resistant to fungal infection. These plants had solved every limitation that agricultural scientists had been trying to address for decades, but they'd solved them in ways that made the resulting organism something other than wheat, something that existed at the intersection of plant, bacteria, and fungal biology. I returned to the greenhouse on May 7th with additional collection equipment and a colleague from the university who specialized in plant pathology. What we found shocked both of us. In the 24 hours since my first visit, the growth had accelerated dramatically. Plants that had been contained mostly within the greenhouse now had shoots breaking through gaps in the doorframe and cracks in the wall panels. The roots we could see through broken floor sections had expanded significantly, creating networks that extended well beyond the greenhouse footprint. And most alarming, the plants had begun spreading into the adjacent field, with new shoots emerging from the soil in a rough circle extending maybe 20 feet from the greenhouse structure. The plants reacted to our presence. When we entered the greenhouse, the stems and leaves oriented toward us, turning to follow our movement through the space in ways that exceeded normal phototropic responses. The grain heads seemed to pulse faster, and we both noticed the air quality changing, becoming thicker and harder to breathe comfortably, like the plants were releasing something into the atmosphere that wasn't ordinary oxygen. My colleague suggested we leave immediately and contact provincial agricultural authorities about potential containment issues. I collected additional samples, including soil from the areas where roots had penetrated, and we exited the greenhouse. By that afternoon, I'd contacted the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the Provincial Environment Ministry, explaining we'd found uncontrolled growth from what appeared to be escaped GMO material that was demonstrating unexpected adaptive characteristics. Both agencies responded with immediate concern, asking detailed questions about the plant's spread rate, its apparent ability to thrive without standard agricultural inputs, and whether it showed any signs of producing viable seed that could spread further. That night, I attempted something that should have worked but didn't. I took one of the stem samples and exposed it to direct flame using a standard laboratory burner. Plant tissue burns. It's organic matter with high cellulose content that should combust readily when exposed to sufficient heat. The sample didn't burn. The outer surface darkened slightly, but the tissue itself resisted ignition. Chemical analysis revealed the plants had evolved a coating that was flame retardant, a complex polymer that the plants were synthesizing from available carbon and other elements. This wasn't a trait that had been intentionally engineered. This was the result of 18 years of uncontrolled evolution, plants adapting to every challenge they encountered, including the theoretical threat of fire. May 9th brought a response team from federal agricultural safety programs. They arrived with containment equipment, hazmat protocols, and questions about exactly what the 1990s research had involved. I provided everything I knew, which wasn't much beyond what was documented in the facility's old records. The original research had focused on developing wheat varieties with enhanced drought resistance through genetic modifications that improved water retention and root development. The trials had been discontinued in 1990, when early results showed the modifications were too aggressive, producing plants that deviated too far from standard wheat characteristics to be commercially viable. What nobody had considered was what would happen if those experimental plants were simply sealed inside a greenhouse and left alone for 18 years, without human management selecting for desired traits and eliminating unwanted variations. The plants had continued evolving according to pure survival optimization. Every generation had selected for characteristics that improved survival in the greenhouse environment: better moisture extraction, more efficient nutrient synthesis, deeper root penetration, resistance to temperature fluctuation, protection against theoretical threats like fire or pest damage. The result was a wheat-derived organism that had optimized itself into something that could survive and spread almost anywhere with minimal resource requirements. The containment team established a quarantine zone covering the greenhouse and surrounding fields. They used specialized herbicide compounds designed for eliminating research crops, chemicals that were far more aggressive than anything used in commercial agriculture. The first application on May 10th killed the above-ground growth in the quarantined area, turning the green tissue brown and withered within hours. But examination of the root systems showed they'd survived. The plants had concentrated their resources underground, maintaining living tissue below the soil surface that could potentially regenerate. A second treatment involved injecting herbicide directly into the soil throughout the quarantine zone, saturating the earth to depths of 3 feet to ensure root system elimination. This approach worked, killing the remaining plant tissue and preventing regeneration. The entire contaminated area was then excavated to a depth of 5 feet, all soil removed and incinerated at temperatures exceeding what plant tissue could survive. The greenhouse structure was dismantled completely and all materials destroyed. The excavated area was filled with clean soil and monitored for any signs of returning growth. During the cleanup process, I learned about similar incidents that had occurred previously. In 1987, a canola research facility in Saskatchewan had experienced an escape of modified plants that showed unusual persistence and spread characteristics. The incident had been handled quietly, the affected area sterilized, and the research program discontinued. In 1992, a barley trial in Manitoba had produced similar results: plants that evolved beyond intended parameters and required extensive remediation to contain. Both incidents had been classified under agricultural biosafety protocols that prevented public discussion, handled as technical failures rather than systemic problems, with how genetic modification research was managed and monitored. The pattern was obvious. Experimental crops modified for enhanced survival characteristics, left unmonitored in contained environments, sometimes evolved in directions that made them difficult to control. Each incident was treated as isolated, but the recurrence across different crops and different facilities suggested the problem was inherent to the research approach. Create organisms optimized for survival, remove human selection pressure, and they'll continue optimizing themselves according to pure evolutionary logic rather than human agricultural needs. I continued working in agricultural research, but shifted my focus away from genetic modification toward traditional breeding approaches. The experience at Vegreville changed how I thought about crop development, made me question whether creating organisms with enhanced capabilities was wise when we couldn't predict or control how those capabilities might continue developing after we stopped managing them. Plants that can survive without water, without fertilizer, without human care sound like solutions to agricultural challenges. But plants that optimize themselves to survive everything humans might do to control them become something else entirely, become invasive species that we engineered ourselves. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't been assigned to evaluate that greenhouse, if it had remained sealed for another decade or two, if the plants inside had continued evolving and spreading underground until they emerged across a wide enough area that containment became impossible. I think about the other research facilities across Canada that operated GMO trials in the 1980s and 90s, about how many of them might have sealed greenhouses or test plots that are currently unmonitored, about what might be growing in those spaces right now without anyone checking whether the experiments we thought we ended actually stopped or just continued without observation. The scariest aspect of biological research isn't creating something dangerous intentionally. It's creating something successful and then discovering that success has its own logic, its own direction, its own capacity to exceed the boundaries we assumed would contain it. We made wheat that could survive drought by pulling moisture from air, and it evolved into something that could survive everything else too, including our attempts to eliminate it. And somewhere in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, in soil that was supposedly sterilized decades ago, I wonder if there are still root systems waiting dormant underground, still carrying those optimized genes, still ready to spread again if conditions permit. Can agricultural science create something too successful to control? Or should we keep pushing modifications further regardless of the containment risks? Drop your perspective in the comments. My name is Aaron, and before September 2020, I didn't believe in possession or demonic influence or anything supernatural that couldn't be explained through psychology or medical science. I was a high school English teacher in Calgary who'd spent 12 years in classrooms helping teenagers understand literature and develop critical thinking skills. When COVID forced schools to move online, I jumped at the opportunity to relocate somewhere quieter, somewhere I could work remotely without the noise and expense of city living. I found a rental listing for a farmhouse near Pincher Creek, a century-old structure on ranch property with decent internet and rent so cheap it seemed almost suspicious. The landlord, a man named Anderson, who owned the surrounding ranch land, explained the low price by saying previous tenants had left quickly and he just wanted someone reliable who'd stay through winter. I should have asked why people kept leaving. I should have wondered what made them go. Instead, I signed a 6-month lease and moved in on September 3rd. And by the time I understood what lived in that house, escape required more strength than I knew I possessed. The farmhouse sat isolated about 2 kilometers from the main ranch buildings, connected by a gravel road that wound through grassland and scattered poplar trees. The structure dated to 1919 based on the cornerstone, built by homesteaders during the settlement boom that followed the First World War. 2 stories, wood frame construction, original plank floors that creaked with age, and windows that rattled when wind blew across the prairie. Anderson had modernized minimally, updated electrical, basic plumbing, propane heating that worked adequately if not efficiently. The furniture was a mix of decades, pieces that had accumulated over generations of tenants, nothing matching but everything functional. I spent the first 2 weeks settling in, establishing my remote teaching routine, arranging my workspace in the upstairs bedroom that had the best internet signal. My classes ran from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, teaching literature and composition to students scattered across Calgary who appeared as faces in video conference windows. The isolation felt peaceful initially. After months of pandemic anxiety in the city, the quiet of rural Alberta seemed restorative. I'd finish teaching, take walks across the ranch property, cook simple meals, read in the evenings, and sleep deeply in the old farmhouse that settled and creaked through the night in ways old buildings do. The time discrepancies started around September 20th. I'd be working at my computer, grading assignments or preparing lessons, and suddenly realize significant time had passed with no memory of those minutes. I'd check the clock showing 11:15, work on grading an essay, look up again, expecting maybe 10 minutes to have elapsed, and find it was 11:47. Nearly 30 minutes gone with nothing to account for them. The essay I'd been grading would be finished, marked with comments and scores in my handwriting, but I had no recollection of completing the work. Initially, I attributed this to pandemic stress, isolation effects, maybe early signs of depression manifesting as dissociative episodes. I'd read about people experiencing cognitive difficulties during lockdown, the toll of months spent in altered social conditions, but the episodes increased in frequency and duration. By early October, I was losing chunks of time almost daily, finding myself in different rooms of the house with no memory of moving there, discovering tasks completed that I didn't remember doing. October 8th, I found the writing. I'd been working at my desk when one of these time gaps occurred, and when awareness returned, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my hand cramped from writing. In front of me were 7 pages of text in handwriting that was mine but slightly wrong, the letters formed correctly but with subtle differences in pressure and spacing. The content described daily life on a prairie farm in winter, talking about feeding livestock in brutal cold, managing limited food supplies, dealing with isolation from neighbors during storms. The writing was detailed and specific, mentioning children's names I didn't recognize, describing a husband who worked the fields and came home angry more often than not. The handwriting looked like mine because it was mine, produced by my hand holding my pen, but I had no memory of writing any of it. The content felt wrong too, like someone else's memories transcribed through my fingers, experiences from a different era described in first-person perspective, as though I'd lived them. I saved the pages, telling myself this was some kind of stress-induced automatic writing, a psychological phenomenon where subconscious thoughts emerge through uncontrolled writing. But the specificity bothered me. The details about 1920s farm life were accurate to the period, including terminology and practices I didn't consciously know. I researched the farmhouse's history through county records and local historical societies. What I found made the automatic writing exponentially more disturbing. In February 1923, a woman named Margaret had killed her husband and 3 children in this house before taking her own life. The coroner's report from that era was brief and clinical, but newspaper accounts were more detailed. Neighbors had noticed Margaret acting strangely in the months before the murders, speaking in languages she shouldn't know, exhibiting strength that seemed impossible for her size, claiming something else was sharing her mind. The local priest had visited multiple times trying to help her, but whatever afflicted Margaret had progressed until one February night, when she'd methodically killed her family and then herself. The house had stood empty for years after the murders before being sold and eventually converted to rental property. No record indicated the structure had been formally blessed or cleansed after the deaths. The murders had simply become local history, something people knew about but didn't discuss, and the house had cycled through tenants for decades with apparently no one staying long-term. After learning this history, the possession episodes became overt rather than subtle. I'd experience full blackouts where I'd regain consciousness mid-action, discovering myself doing things I'd never choose to do. I came to awareness standing in the bathroom, with a razor blade pressed against my wrist, the pressure just short of breaking skin. I woke up in the night to find myself standing at the top of the stairs, body positioned, like I'd been about to throw myself down. Once I regained consciousness while speaking, hearing my voice say things in a language I didn't understand, realizing I'd been talking for an unknown duration in what sounded like German, though I'd never studied that language. The physical sensations during these episodes were unmistakable. Temperature changes that made no environmental sense, sudden drops that left me shivering despite the heating system running normally. The air would taste metallic, like I was breathing copper dust that coated my tongue and throat. Smells emerged from nowhere. Sulfur that burned my sinuses, decay that suggested something rotting inside the walls, scents that had no natural source but saturated rooms until I had to leave gasping for breathable air. Touch sensations were the most violating. I'd feel presence on my skin when nothing visible was there, pressure on my shoulders like hands gripping me, touches on my face that left no marks but felt absolutely real. My own hands would move without my control, picking up objects, writing more pages of that disturbing historical narrative, once striking my face hard enough to leave bruises I couldn't explain. I called Anderson on October 19th, told him I was experiencing severe problems with the house and needed to discuss lease termination. He arrived within an hour, listened to a carefully edited version of my experiences that focused on stress and isolation rather than possession. He looked uncomfortable, admitted that 5 previous tenants since 1985 had left suddenly, all reporting unusual experiences they attributed to the house's age and isolation. He offered to let me out of the lease with no penalty, said he understood if the property wasn't suitable for my needs, but something in his expression suggested he knew more than he was saying, that these departures followed patterns he recognized but wouldn't articulate. I should have left immediately. Any rational person would have packed and driven back to Calgary that same day, but part of me couldn't accept what was happening, needed to prove there was a logical explanation, wanted to believe I could manage the situation through willpower and rational thinking. This was psychological, stress-induced, explicable through medical science. I scheduled a telehealth appointment with a doctor, described my symptoms in clinical terms, got a prescription for anti-anxiety medication that I started taking immediately. The medication made no difference. The possession episodes intensified. I lost entire days, regaining awareness to find multiple pages of historical writing completed, meals cooked and eaten with no memory of preparation, my body exhausted like I'd been engaged in intense physical activity while my consciousness was absent. The entity, because I'd stopped being able to deny something else was involved, began leaving messages. I'd find words written on mirrors, scratched into wooden furniture, spelled out using items from my kitchen, mine, and stay, and Margaret. On October 27th, I contacted a Catholic church in Lethbridge and explained I needed help with what I believed was a spiritual problem. The priest who responded was a younger man named Kyler, who'd trained in pastoral counseling and took requests like mine seriously enough to drive out to Pincher Creek. He arrived in the afternoon, asked detailed questions about my experiences, examined the house while speaking prayers I didn't understand, and confirmed that he felt something present in the structure that shouldn't be there. Kyler performed an informal blessing, as much as he could offer without formal church approval for full exorcism. He prayed throughout the farmhouse, sprinkled holy water, placed blessed medals in several rooms, and spoke directly to whatever entity occupied the space, commanding it to leave in the name of religious authority. The response was immediate and violent. The temperature dropped so fast I could see our breath. Windows rattled despite no wind outside. And I felt something surge inside me like a wave of pure malevolent consciousness asserting control. What happened next came to me only through Kyler's account later. He said my entire demeanor changed in seconds, posture shifting, voice dropping to tones I shouldn't be able to produce, eyes focusing on him with recognition and hatred. The entity spoke through me in what Kyler identified as German, saying things that made him physically step back. My body moved toward him, with intention that was clearly aggressive, and he reported feeling physical pressure on his chest, difficulty breathing, intense pain that had no medical source. He began praying more forcefully, invoking protection, commanding the entity to release me, and after several minutes that felt eternal to him, I collapsed. I regained consciousness on the floor with Kyler kneeling beside me looking shaken and pale. He helped me to the couch and admitted this was beyond his training and authority, that I needed to leave the house immediately and not return, that whatever occupied this structure was powerful and deeply entrenched. He'd contacted his bishop about arranging formal intervention, but the church processes were slow, and I couldn't wait for official approval. I needed to leave today now, as soon as possible, but the entity fought my attempt to go. Every time I tried to pack or prepare to leave, I'd lose time and regain awareness having unpacked or put things back in place. My body wouldn't cooperate with my intentions to escape. Hours passed in this struggle, consciousness flickering in and out, my sense of self fragmenting under pressure from whatever shared my mind. Kyler stayed, praying continuously, maintaining presence that seemed to limit the entity's full control, even if it couldn't break its hold entirely. Around midnight, I experienced a moment of absolute clarity. The entity's attention had shifted toward Kyler, focused on forcing him to leave, and in that brief gap, I had full control of my body again. I grabbed my car keys, my phone, my wallet, nothing else, and ran for the door. Kyler understood immediately, moved to support me, helped me to my vehicle while continuing to pray. I started the engine and drove, leaving everything I owned in that house, abandoning a lease and a life I'd tried to build in favor of survival. I drove directly to Calgary, arrived around 3 a.m, checked into a hotel, and finally felt the crushing weight lift from my consciousness. The distance and escape seemed to break whatever connection the entity had established. I could think clearly again, could control my body fully, could exist without feeling something else pushing against the boundaries of my awareness. 3 days later, Anderson called to tell me the farmhouse had burned. The fire started on the night of October 30th, around 2 a.m. No clear cause determined. The structure completely destroyed before volunteer firefighters from Pincher Creek could respond effectively to the remote location. He sounded more relieved than concerned about the loss, mentioned that insurance would cover the structure, and maybe this was for the best, that the house had caused problems for too long. I never returned to retrieve my belongings. Everything I'd left behind burned with the house, consumed in fire that I believe was either the entity's rage at losing its host or some final intervention from forces beyond my understanding. I returned to teaching in Calgary, found a new apartment, rebuilt the life I'd abandoned when I thought rural isolation would be restorative. But I'm not the same person who moved to that farmhouse in September. I know now that consciousness isn't singular, that what we think of as self can be invaded and displaced, that possession is real and terrifying in ways fiction never captures. I still lose time occasionally, brief moments where awareness flickers and returns with minutes missing. I still taste metal sometimes when I'm alone, still feel pressure on my shoulders that has no physical source, still find myself writing things I don't remember composing. The entity may have stayed in that house when it burned, or pieces of it may have attached to me during those weeks of shared consciousness. I don't know which possibility is true, and I'm terrified to investigate deeply enough to find out. I just try to stay in public spaces, maintain connections with other people, never allow myself to become too isolated because isolation creates openings for things that wait for access to human consciousness. And I never, ever rent old farmhouses, no matter how cheap or peaceful they seem, because some structures hold darkness that survives generations, waiting for occupants vulnerable enough to serve as hosts for entities that refuse to release what they've claimed as theirs. If isolation made you vulnerable to something that wasn't yourself, Would you even recognize when you stopped being fully in control of your own mind? Comment your thoughts below. My name is Onyx, and I've worked as a seismologist contractor for oil and gas companies across Western Canada since 2005. My specialty involves monitoring subsurface activity, interpreting seismic data to help companies understand what's happening kilometers below the surface, and distinguishing between natural geological processes and human-caused disturbances like drilling or hydraulic fracturing. The work is technical, precise, and typically devoid of mystery. Earthquakes have signatures, industrial activity creates recognizable patterns, and geological formations behave according to principles that are well documented and predictable. In February 2017, I encountered something that violated every principle I'd built my career understanding. A signal emerged from deep beneath the boreal forest north of Peace River, a pattern that suggested neither natural geology nor human activity. And the 3 weeks I spent investigating that anomaly convinced me that some questions about what exists beneath the Earth's surface should remain unanswered because the implications of certain answers are too disturbing for human consciousness to process comfortably. I was contracted by a mid-sized energy company operating in the Peace River area to investigate unusual readings from their remote sensor array. These monitoring stations dot northern Alberta, tracking seismic activity to ensure drilling operations don't trigger dangerous geological responses and to detect any natural earthquake activity that might threaten infrastructure. The sensors in question were positioned approximately 80 kilometers north of Peace River, in dense boreal forest accessible only by winter road or helicopter. The data they'd been transmitting since early February showed a pattern that the company's standard analysis software couldn't classify. I arrived at the Regional Operations Center in Peace River on February 9, 2017, and spent 2 days reviewing the accumulated data before deciding field investigation was necessary. The signal wasn't earthquake activity. Earthquakes generate specific waveforms with clear P waves and S waves that propagate through rock in predictable ways. This signal was different. A low-frequency pulse occurring at regular intervals of exactly 7.3 hours. The frequency was below normal human hearing range, subsonic vibrations that instruments could detect but ears couldn't process as sound. The regularity was what made it impossible to classify as natural. Geological processes don't operate on precise schedules. Magma movement, tectonic stress release, underground water flow, all of these create irregular patterns with natural variation. This signal had variation measured in milliseconds across observation periods spanning days, suggesting either artificial origin or geological processes operating under control that natural systems don't possess. I flew to the sensor site on February 12th with Maria, a junior geophysicist at the company, assigned to assist with field data collection. We landed via helicopter in a clearing where the sensor array had been installed, 3 kilometers of monitoring equipment arranged in a grid pattern that allowed triangulation of subsurface signals. The forest was thick spruce and pine, snow-covered and absolutely silent in the way northern wilderness becomes during winter, when animal activity drops to minimum levels. Setting up our field equipment took most of the day, establishing temporary shelter, powering instruments through portable generators, and verifying our sensors were functioning correctly and synchronized with the existing array. The signal was immediately apparent once our equipment came online. Every 7.3 hours, like clockwork, the instruments registered a pulse originating from approximately 3 kilometers below the surface. At that depth, we should have been detecting bedrock, stable Precambrian shield formations that had been geologically inactive for hundreds of millions of years. Instead, something down there was generating organized vibrations with precision that seemed engineered rather than natural. The frequency characteristics showed complexity beyond simple oscillation. When I ran spectral analysis, the signal contained harmonic structures, multiple frequencies layered in relationships that suggested information encoding rather than random vibration. Maria suggested various explanations over our first 2 days on site. Underground cavity resonating with some periodic pressure source, perhaps connected to distant drilling operations. Crystalline rock formations that could generate piezoelectric effects under specific stress conditions. Equipment malfunction despite multiple sensors detecting identical patterns. We tested every hypothesis systematically, ruling them out one by one through data analysis and additional measurements. By February 15th, we'd eliminated every conventional explanation. The signal was real, it was organized, and it was coming from geological depths that shouldn't be producing any signal at all. I contacted the company and requested access to historical seismic data for the region, anything that might show whether this signal had appeared before. What arrived via email on February 16th changed the investigation completely. Archived data showed identical signals recorded briefly in 1952, 1934, 1989, and 2006. Each occurrence had lasted between 3 and 6 weeks before stopping abruptly. Each time, the signal appeared in roughly the same location, originating from similar depths, maintaining the same 7.3-hour interval. The 1952 detection had been during early oil exploration surveys, dismissed as equipment error. The 1974 occurrence was better documented, but classified as unexplained geological anomaly. By 2006, digital recording allowed detailed analysis, but the signal stopped before comprehensive investigation could be organized. And without ongoing data, the incident was filed away as a curiosity. The pattern suggested something that activated periodically, operated for limited duration, then went dormant again. But the intervals between activations weren't regular. Gaps of 22 years, then 15, then 17, now 11 years since the last occurrence. If this was some kind of automated system, its timing mechanism was degrading or responding to external factors we couldn't identify. If it was geological, it represented processes with periodicities that didn't match any known phenomena. We stayed at the site, collecting continuous data, trying to extract additional information from the signal. Maria noticed that our presence seemed to affect the pattern slightly. The signal's amplitude increased by roughly 3% after we'd been on site for 4 days. A change that was statistically significant, but didn't suggest any mechanism for how our instruments or presence could influence something 3 kilometers underground. Over the following week, we documented additional subtle changes. Minor frequency shifts, slight variations in pulse timing that remained within microseconds, but represented the first deviations from perfect regularity we'd observed. The psychological effects began around February 20th. Subtle at first, but increasingly difficult to ignore. Both Maria and I started experiencing a sensation I can only describe as being perceived, not watched by anything visible, but noticed by something vast and distant that was suddenly aware we were paying attention to it. The feeling intensified when we were standing directly above the signal's calculated origin point, a spot in the forest we'd marked with survey flags. Standing there created profound unease that had no rational source, a gut-level certainty that something incomprehensibly large existed below us and was, in some way we couldn't articulate, becoming aware of our presence. Maria reported dreams during this period that matched mine with disturbing precision. She described being underground in absolute darkness, surrounded by pressure, with the sense that she was being incorporated into something, her consciousness dissolving into a larger awareness that existed in the rock itself. I'd been having identical dreams since February 18th, but hadn't mentioned them, assuming they were stress responses to isolation and the investigation's strangeness. Learning she experienced the same thing suggested either shared psychology, responding to environmental factors, or something genuinely affecting both of us through mechanisms that went beyond conventional cause and effect. The physical sensations were undeniable. The ground vibrated continuously at levels just below conscious perception, but if you stood still and focused, you could feel it through your boots. A tremor that matched the signal's low frequency. The vibration seemed to resonate in chest cavities, making breathing feel slightly wrong, like the air pressure was fluctuating in ways too subtle for instruments to detect but noticeable to human physiology. After extended periods near the epicenter, both of us experienced headaches, nausea, and disorientation that faded when we moved away, but returned immediately upon approaching the marked location again. I spent hours analyzing the signal's information content, running every decoding algorithm I could access through satellite internet connection. The pattern contained structure that resembled communication, segments that repeated with variation suggesting grammar or syntax, but I couldn't extract meaning from it. The signal wasn't designed for human interpretation, assuming it was designed at all. It might have been purely functional, a byproduct of whatever process generated it, but the complexity suggested purpose beyond mechanical operation. February 24th brought a discovery that fundamentally altered my understanding of what we were investigating. I'd been reviewing the complete historical record when I noticed something the previous analyses had missed. The signal in 2017 was stronger than in 2006, which had been stronger than in 1989. Across all recorded instances, the amplitude had been increasing steadily. Whatever produced this signal was either getting closer to the surface, was growing in size or energy output, or was becoming more active with each emergence cycle. Extrapolating the pattern forward suggested that in the next occurrence, perhaps in another 8 to 15 years, the signal might be strong enough to cause measurable surface effects, possibly even perceptible vibrations or sounds that normal human senses could detect without instruments. We discussed whether to recommend drilling exploratory bore holes to investigate the source directly. The depth was within reach of current drilling technology, but the cost would be enormous, and the company had no financial incentive to spend millions satisfying scientific curiosity. Maria argued we had an obligation to understand what was generating signals from deep inside the Canadian Shield, that this represented a geological phenomenon that could advance understanding of planetary processes. I was less certain. Something about the increasing amplitude, the psychological effects we'd experienced, and the profound sense of being noticed made me question whether direct investigation was wise. On February 27th, 13 days after our arrival on site, the signal stopped. It didn't fade or diminish gradually. At 14:47 local time, mid-pulse, the vibrations simply ceased. Our instruments showed nothing, the ground went silent, and the oppressive sense of being perceived lifted immediately. Maria and I looked at each other with identical expressions of relief mixed with profound unease. The timing was too perfect, too responsive to our investigation. It felt like something had been awake and active, had detected our attention and analysis, and had made a decision to go dormant again rather than continue operating. Under observation, we remained on site for another 4 days, hoping the signal would resume, but the sensors detected only normal background seismic activity. On March 3rd, we packed our equipment and returned to Peace River to file our report. I wrote a detailed technical summary of our findings, noted the historical pattern of periodic activation, and recommended long-term monitoring to capture future occurrences. The company accepted the report, thanked us for our work, and filed the entire investigation under proprietary research that wouldn't be published or shared beyond internal documentation. I returned to my normal contract work, monitoring conventional seismic activity for various clients across Alberta and Saskatchewan. But I couldn't stop thinking about what we documented north of Peace River. Something exists 3 kilometers beneath the Canadian Shield that operates on schedules measured in decades, that generates organized signals complex enough to suggest purpose or communication, and that appears to be aware when it's being studied. The increasing amplitude across multiple emergent cycles suggests progression, like whatever is down there is approaching some kind of threshold or building toward an event we can't predict. The most disturbing aspect isn't the signal itself, but the implications of what could produce it. At 3 kilometers depth, in rock that's been geologically stable for hundreds of millions of years, nothing should be operating with precision measured in microseconds. If it's artificial, something was placed there long before human civilization reached technological capability for deep construction. If it's biological, it represents life forms adapted to exist in conditions we consider impossible for complex organisms. If it's geological, it suggests Earth processes we don't understand operating according to principles that include what looks like awareness and responsive behavior. I've checked the sensor data from that site every few months since 2017, watching for signs the signal has returned. As of now, the location remains quiet, showing only baseline activity consistent with stable bedrock. But I know it will activate again, probably sometime between 2025 and 2032 based on the historical pattern. When it does, it will be stronger than before, closer to whatever threshold it's been approaching across decades of emergent cycles. And I genuinely don't know whether humanity should investigate more aggressively when that happens, or should leave it alone, should treat it as a mystery we're not equipped to solve, should recognize that some things existing beneath our feet are perhaps best left undisturbed in the depths where they have existed since, long before we evolved to wonder about them. The boundary between geology and consciousness isn't as clear as I'd believed before February 2017. Something can exist in rock and time, can operate with intentionality while being fundamentally non-human, can notice us, noticing it and respond by choosing dormancy over continued observation. Whether that something is ancient technology, unknown life, or Earth itself manifesting properties we've never recognized, I cannot determine. I only know it's there. It's been there far longer than our species, and it's getting stronger with each cycle of emergence. Eventually, it will become strong enough that instruments won't be necessary to detect it, and then we'll have to decide as a civilization how to respond to something that challenges every assumption we've made about what exists in the deep places beneath our world. When something vast and patient lives kilometers beneath the ground and seems to wake up every decade or so, should we try to understand it or hope it stays asleep? Let me know what you think in the comments.